So we're talking about the relationship of the American administration to the State of Israel. So that leads me to Mrs. Krupnik. Mrs. Krupnik is she's at a dinner party, a very elegant dinner party, and she's wearing this fabulous diamond around her neck. The guy sitting next to her says, "Mrs. Krupnik, that's quite a diamond." "Oh, it's the Krupnik diamond, but it comes with a curse." "What's the curse?" "Mr. Krupnik." And that about sums up the discussion on the relationship of the State of Israel to successive American administrations. Let's begin before the creation of the State of Israel with Roosevelt. A few observations on Roosevelt, in effect a prelude to the story, and begin with FDR and the Holocaust. These issues have been well rehearsed by everyone, historians and journalists who debate could Roosevelt have done more. You know, on the one hand, you have the David Wyman and the people around him. FDR did not do enough. Why did he not bomb Auschwitz and such? That'll be debated endlessly. Arthur Schlesinger, FDR was the best president in history, best leader in the history of the world. He could do no wrong. My own sense my own inclination is with the late, great Lucy Davidovich. I don't always agree with her. She was a little on the conservative side. But her view was that the best way to help the Jews was to win the war. Had we entered the war a year earlier, 1 million Jewish lives would have been saved, but this ignores political realities. There was no way that Roosevelt could have entered the war a year earlier. Roosevelt's astounding accomplishment was to turn around a country from deep isolationism to interventionism. That's why we remember Roosevelt. And this is for a different lecture, but on Zionism, FDR never gave more than lip service to the Zionists, basically sided with the State Department and with the British. Caution on Palestine, there was no Israel, we're talking about, Roosevelt died in 1945, 44. Caution on Palestine made sense to the Allies, but he was not an anti-Zionist. He was a practical guy. There was a war going on, he had bigger problems. Would FDR, had he lived, supported statehood? Well, he was a political guy with good political instincts, as was Truman. And here's where the story begins. Truman inherited Roosevelt's Palestine legacy. What was the legacy? A frantic Zionist lobby, a pro-Zionist Congress, a destroyed European jury, DPs, hold that thought, the DPs were crucial, and a foreign policy bureaucracy absolutely united, with one small exception, but that proved to be important, I'll get there in a minute, dead set against a Jewish state. Also, anti-Zionist foreign leaders, important allies, such as Clement Attlee. Clement Attlee, within minutes of the end of the war, the British unbelievably tossed out Churchill and voted in a Labour government, Clement Attlee, and we all thought that would be fabulous for the Jews, Labour. Of course, how wrong we were. Clement Attlee's foreign minister was Ernest Bevin, who was a nightmare. Put that aside, that's what Truman inherited. He inherited a mess. The anti-Zionist forces in the State Department, I'll stay with that for a moment, well-known story. James Forrestal, an important guy, he was the Secretary of Defense. He was, not to put too fine a point on it, an out-and-out anti-Semite. I have a very high threshold. I've written about this stuff. When it comes to anti-Semitism, I have a high threshold. Forrestal was not a nice guy. We don't give him shlishi. Dean Acheson, who was at the time the Undersecretary and thence the Secretary of State, he was not a friend. George Kennan, Robert Lovett, Lloyd Henderson, he was an important guy. He was the Middle East Affairs Director. And of course, the worst of the worst, a great leader, George Marshall, who was the Secretary of State, were all opposed to the Zionist agenda. The rationale: endanger oil supplies, drive Arabs into the arms of the Soviet Union. Very important point, which we'll come back to a number of times. Risk rushing U.S. troops to Palestine to save Jews. These were well-rehearsed arguments. And indeed, they're worth listening to because they resonate low onto the present day. The only pro-Zionist in the group was Presidential Counsel Clark Clifford. He did not have a formal position in the State Department. He was working in the White House. And actually it was to everybody's advantage that he was not part of that foreign policy bureaucracy. Famous meeting, May 12th, in the White House, May 12, 47, a complete brawl, balagan gamur, as we say in Latin. Marshall almost resigned, but did not, because to do so would have given the anti-communists in Congress ammo. And of course, that was when Truman decided to support the state, to support partition. Truman was not a Zionist, but for him, he was what I would call a refugee Zionist. Refugee Zionism had meaning. It's difficult to determine who irritated Harry S. Truman more, the Zionists or the State Department. The Zionists were driving him crazy. The conventional wisdom, of course, has it, and here is telescoping a large discussion to a couple of sentences, because we have a lot of administrations to get to, and I hope we get to Obama before the end of the hour. Conventional wisdom has it that it was ethnic pandering that prompted Truman to support the new state, shilling for Jewish votes. My own sense is that it was not. Good reasons to argue that it was not. I'll come to the reasons in a minute. But Truman, as I said, he was what I would call a refugee Zionist. Humanitarian concerns, huge refugee problem, DPs all over the place, moved Truman as much, well, not as much as, much more than the Jewish vote. The Jewish vote was not an issue. When it came down to it, Truman's surprise victory in 1948, remember the Chicago Tribune headline, Dewey elected, blah, blah. It was labor that did it, not Israel. Truman had solid support of labor. He inherited that from Roosevelt. And maybe more to the point, Truman was canny enough to understand two things. First, the risk of an oil embargo was grossly overstated. In 1948, we didn't import any oil, 6% of the oil that we used. Only 8% of that 6% was from Saudi Arabia. And the others, Gulf states, weren't doing any oil. Second, recognition of Israel served as a useful hedge against the Soviets, who were making hay out of chaos. That's an important point as well. And it paid off. I'll come back to this in a couple of minutes, but we have to remember that in 1948, Israel briefly flirted with non-alignment. Don't forget, it was a socialist collectivist state. There was a socialist, Mapai, the Mapai Party, the Labor, what we became known as the Labor Party, did not have a majority, but put together a coalition with parties of the left, Mapai, Mapam, Achdut Avodah, which was much further left, Mapam, my party, which was a Marxist party, Mizrahi, which was left of center, Hapoel Mizrahi, and so on and so forth. Poalei Agudat Israel, which was way over to the left. Anyway, BG and the ruling Mapai resolved never to be without support of a Western power, preferably the United States. And Truman, in terms of the Jewish vote, Truman understood that, they're going to vote for me anyway, which is true, legacy of the New Deal and so on and so forth. There's a lot more to say about Truman, but I want to move along to the nightmare years. Ike, Eisenhower, and of course the person who crafted Eisenhower's foreign policy was Dulles, John Foster Dulles, right. If the world is divided into heroes and villains, Dulles, as I said earlier, he was not a nice guy. We certainly don't give him Shlishi. The Eisenhower administration was serious and seriously bad. Not to put too fine a point on it, it was the pits. Unlike Truman, Ike and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, had no doubts whatever about their foreign policy competence. They did their foreign policy, and that was it. The Eisenhower era, I would characterize it as the coldest period in the entire U.S.-Israel relationship, and that includes Carter. We'll come to Carter in a couple of minutes. There was no prospect for the relationship to upgrade into a full-blown alliance. It was barely a relationship. whatever the problems we've had in subsequent with certain administrations, Reagan's anger with Begin, Carter, as I said, Bush's rage with the first Bush rage with Shamir, the first Bush's one lonely guy comment, which I want to talk about in a couple of minutes, and his guy James Baker's F the Jews, we'll get there. Clinton's loathing of Bibi, and whatever was going on with Obama. America's bond with Israel. Let me tick off a few points, just to prefigure, as the Christians say, to prefigure the relationship. Massive foreign aid, arms subsidies, cooperation on intelligence, very important, security guarantees, coordination on regional strategies, political support, protective vetoes in the Security Council, positive rhetoric, very important, congressional ardor, respect for the pro-Israel lobby. None of these indicators was in place, was there under Ike and Dulles, except for Congress, and Congress was not a player at all in the America-Israel relationship during those years. Dulles' foreign policy, which is called the New Look, whatever that meant, was based on maximum deterrence of communism, set the stage for other administrations as well. 4 points to be noted. Bekitzer, regional alliances was a Dulles fave. He spent his whole foreign policy career in pulling together little alliances, NATO, CETO, DIDO, whatever they were, all around the world. Israel was not part of that. I'll talk about it in 1 second. Ike was a Republican, and Jews had been very visible in the New Deal. There was not an unimportant dynamic. There was wariness about Israel's motives in the early 1950s. Revanchism, in other words, is Israel interested in going back and getting this land that they thought was it, drive the Arabs out? These were all factors. It all came to a head in the Suez Campaign, as we remember, and not so much Suez Campaign, the aftermath of the campaign in 1956. Ben-Gurion had to follow France. He was fearful of endangering his new armed pipeline with France. Ike promptly suspended whatever minimal aid there was to Israel, and it was minimal, a trickle, forced a UN resolution mandating Israel's withdrawal from the Sinai, and his rationale was that gunboat diplomacy would open the Middle East to the Soviet Union. Maybe. More to the point, Eisenhower, as did, it's the obverse side of the coin from Truman, but the identical dynamic. Politically, of course, Eisenhower correctly understood that there was little to fear in that election year, 1956, right? So it was September, October 1956, almost immediately followed by the election. He was canny. He understood that there was little to fear in that election from the pro-Israel advocates. American Jews were going to vote for Stevenson anyway, and they did. The famous memo, infamous memo of Eisenhower to one of his advisors, Sherman Adams, who subsequently went to jail, but that's a different story. They all went to jail. I gave standing orders to the State Department, that we handle our affairs exactly as though we did not have a Jew in America. And he wasn't wrong. Ike's problem was more from the right. The issue was Nasser, recognition of China, acceptance of Soviet arms more than it was from Israel. But Ike protected Nasser, not because he loved him, he abominated him, but because he wanted to save containment, the famous word containment, the containment of the Soviet Union, and the idea of bolstering friendly states in the Middle East, mainly at the time Jordan, Saudi Arabia, which was part of what became known as the Eisenhower Doctrine, did not include Israel. Furthermore, as I suggested earlier, Israel was socialist. English translation, communist, at least to the McCarthy-besotted 1950s and to that administration. It was not clear to anyone, even going into the 50s, that Israel would not tilt in the, remember the First World, the Second World, the Third World. So the Second World was the Soviet Union and that group. It was not clear to anyone that Israel would not tilt in the Second World's direction. And as I said earlier, BG, in fact, bucked his own socialist majority in the Knesset, 63 seats out of 120, to align with the West rather than remain unaligned. So it was all about communism. Dulles was all about alliances, as I said. The bottom line, it was a terrible time, even though by 1960, the end of the Eisenhower administration, Ben-Gurion was looking a little bit better to Ike. Dulles died the previous year, and Israel was beginning to look a little bit better, but it was still awful. Whatever the problems since, there was no comparison to what was going on in the Eisenhower administration. It was barely a relationship. A lot more to say about the Eisenhower administration, but let me move on to JFK, in some ways the most interesting of all the administrations, of all the presidents. By the way, feel free to toss out questions if you have any questions of clarification or whatever. JFK is elected president in 1960. He's a Democrat, his first Catholic president. He inherited a mess. He took over from the least sympathetic presidency in American history. The Middle East is a shambles. Britain is useless. Iraq was lost. There was a coup in Iraq in 1958. Egypt and Syria are solidly, by 1960, in the Soviet orbit. Conservative monarchs, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, exposed, more than a little nervous, about NASA, who was, how do you characterize NASA? Kind of a gangster, kind of an adventurer, an expansionist. Israel was jittery. There are threats of nuclear war, including in the Middle East. Israel had begun work on its reactor in Dimona, I think in 1960, around that time, 59 or 60. And Israel certainly in Washington's bad graces. Bekitzer, Kennedy turned it around. Now, how this turned around 180 degrees, from the nightmare of Eisenhower Dulles to more than a relationship to an alliance. Now, how that happened is a large story. It's a whole semester's work. And as I said earlier, one of the 3 books I suggested is Warren Bass's Support Any Friend. Terrific book, which tells the story in a gripping manner. But I would suggest that I'll boil it down to 3 points. First, Jack Kennedy, the most important thing to say about John Kennedy is that he was not his father, Joe Kennedy, which is very important. Now, Joe Kennedy, well known, also not a nice guy. The odor of anti-Semitism was clearly floating around Joe Kennedy all the time, and kind of definitely a pro-Nazi, sympathetic to Hitler, let's put it that way, and very cool to any kind of Zionist or Jewish aspirations. Jewish, the very word to Joe Kennedy was kind of odious, and Zionist aspirations. The second point is the crucial point, I would say, and that is it was JFK who clearly had more than sympathy, but support of Zionism. He liked the idea for a number of reasons, but the guy who had an affinity with Zionists, with Jews, in the first instance, and certainly with the idea of a Jewish state and the state of Israel, was his brother Bobby Kennedy. Now, Robert F. Kennedy was a significant guy in the administration. He was Attorney General, but he was the guy who, more than anyone else, had JFK's ear, and JFK had his. Bobby Kennedy, by the way, was actually in Israel. He was in Tel Aviv the day that statehood was declared. He was covering the story for the Boston Globe, and and he writes this very glowing story. And of course, the Globe, anybody who knows Boston today, but especially then, this was, 100% an Irish city, nothing else but, a few Armenians, a few Italians. It was an Irish city. The Globe headline had nothing to do with Bobby Kennedy's story. The Globe headline was, "Jews stick it to British." great moment. It was accurate, but anyway, so Bobby Kennedy had this affinity for Israel and moved his brother to establish more than a relationship, an alliance. They were clearly, the two of them clearly were able to overcome the atmosphere of their father, Joe. Anybody who was, I remember my mother used to say, anybody who was disliked both by the Zionists and by the NAACP must have been doing something. Anyway, again, it was the State Department that was the problem. Dean Rusk was the Secretary of State. He was okay, not great. Thank God it wasn't William Fulbright, who was an anti-Zionist, no question about that. But still, it was a problem, most formidable bureaucratic opponent of rapprochement with Israel, and more to the point, the most enthusiastic bureaucratic advocate of Egypt. The third, and that leads me to point number 3 in terms of JFK, was maybe the most important. It had nothing to do with Israel, but everything to do with Nasser. The issue, the foreign policy issue for Kennedy during Kennedy's brief period, the famous 1,000 days, 1961 to 63, was Nasser, whom Kennedy absolutely abominated. Nasser did everybody a favor. Again, this is a huge story that's laid out very wonderfully in Warren Bass's book and other books. Those of us who were around then will remember this. He got himself involved in an absurd war in Yemen. How that happened is an interesting story, but it became Nasser's Vietnam, which led to a regional war involving everyone except for Israel, the Saudis, and so Nasser's adventurism in Yemen and Saudi Arabia enabled what Rabbi Soloveitchik used to call a matir. It enabled the U.S. to move closer to an all-out alliance with Israel. The rise of the Ba'athists in Syria was not exactly endearing to JFK either, and the only other thing I want to say about the Kennedy administration was a virtuosic exegesis of Israeli policy done by, I don't know if anybody remembers the name Walworth Barber. Nobody under the age of 60 remembers Walworth Barber. Walworth Barber was America's ambassador to the Jewish state during the Kennedy administration. He was an unusually able diplomat. He was a career diplomat, and he wrote a long memo, which I'll summarize, and I'll do it in 2 or 3 sentences. He concluded, first, that Israel was not pursuing a revanchist policy with respect to the West Bank, whatever dreams they might harbor, that the only condition for a West Bank problem would be the arrival of a Nasserite government in Jordan. Don't forget, in 1963, there was no PLO. It was all about Nasser. Third point, related, obviously, there would be little the U.S. could do to prevent an Israeli strike if Israel felt its existence was at stake. 1963, 4 years before 1967. The memo, you can find the memo online. It's worth reading. Then, of course, there was the question of Dimona. One of the big what-ifs of history. JFK, had he lived, might have made an issue of Dimona. It's clear in the various biographies of Kennedy, especially in the Schlesinger biography. I actually had a conversation with Schlesinger about this before Schlesinger died many years ago. JFK, the one thing interesting about JFK had nothing to do with Israel, is that JFK had this horror of nuclear war. He learned this, or it was Harold Macmillan, who had been a prime minister of Israel, who was nuts about nuclear war, on the negative side, who taught JFK to say what he said about nuclear war. So my sense is, it's actually Schlesinger's sense is that JFK would, in all likelihood, have made a big issue of Dimona. So 4 features of JFK, and then we'll move on. New policy toward Israel, new decision-making structures. JFK bypassed his State Department on matters having to do with Israel. He was the Secretary of State in terms of the Middle East, he and Bobby Kennedy. There were no new Arab policy other than abomination of Nasser. Moving on to LBJ. Are you with me? Great, terrific. You with me? Good. LBJ's Middle East policy, Lyndon Johnson, he had come out of the Senate. He was more than powerful, he was kind of the Ayatollah of the Senate while he was the majority leader. It can't be understood apart from the Six-Day War. Now, Jews loved Johnson. We had a love affair with Johnson, even more than we had a love affair with Roosevelt. First, two reasons. First of all, he was a liberal, and the community at that time was, before the word liberal became a bad word, war on poverty, civil rights legislation, and as senator and majority leader, he had championed Israel's cause in 1956, and generally during the dark days of Eisenhower Dulles. He lost the battle. There was no way that even Lyndon Johnson could stand up to John Foster Dulles. Nonetheless, we Jews loved him. Now, as a general proposition, LBJ, if anything, reinforced JFK's relationship with Israel. For the first time, we began seeing serious economic aid, military aid, cooperation on intelligence, as I said, very important, maybe the most important thing, other areas. LBJ's policy of reinforcing conservative Arab regimes was identical as well, but with LBJ, it was different, it was deeper. Lyndon Johnson came from the hill country of Texas, and Robert Caro's wonderful multi-volume biography of Johnson talks about this. He had a biblically based religious background. Lyndon Johnson identified with the chalutzim, the pioneers, those who took chalutz, take something out of the land, as working, self-made men. The cause of labor, Israel, socialist collectivist, labor Zionist, the cause of labor Zionist social justice resonated with Lyndon Johnson. Masada was the Alamo. I didn't say that. Johnson said that. It's a quote, Masada is the Alamo. He loved it. Lyndon Johnson personally identified with Israel. In contrast, he viewed the Arabs as backward, alien, culturally different. All of this played out in a policy of increased military aid to Israel, combined with efforts to isolate Nasser. Unsuccessful, of course, unsuccessful in his efforts to persuade Nasser to limit his arms acquisition from the Soviet Union, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm not going to talk about the Six-Day War. Plenty has been written about the two splendid books on the Six-Day War, very different one from the other, but need to be read in tandem, and that's a book by Michael Oren and by Tom Segev, which is which. One is called 1967 and one is called 6 Days of War. I always confuse the two. They're worth reading. They're great. But I'll note the implications of the 6-Day War. First, for the first time, the global importance of the Middle East was raised. It was important. It led to accelerated efforts at an Arab-Israeli settlement. Garnished helfen, but it did. It reinforced the continuing preference for conservative Arab regimes, and by the way, the Six-Day War in America has nothing to do with successive administrations, but I'll say this, before 1967, in the 1950s, Israel was simply not on the agenda of the American Jewish community, contrary to conventional wisdom, except for the Zionist organizations, which were weak and, tautologically Zionist. But other than 1956, it was a quiet period in terms of American Jewish organizations. That two things happened in the mid-1960s that radically turned this around. The Six-Day War in 1967, beginnings of the Soviet Jewry movement a little bit earlier, 1964, 65. And for the first time, Israel became the priority on the agenda. The priority for the American Jews, the priority issue on the American Jewish agenda in the 1950s was civil rights. Right. So, and church-state separation as well, immigration reform, but civil rights, that was the agenda. After 1967, it became a more particularistic Jewish agenda. Anyway, a lot has been written about Resolution 242, right, which was to this day the controlling document Few remember, by the way, when in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, the huge Arab blunder that they did not accept a draft resolution calling for Israeli withdrawal, quote unquote, without delay, in return for some vague declaration of non-belligerency with no provisions for negotiations, for direct negotiations. America and the USSR accepted the draft. Israel might have gone along with it, but the Arabs rejected it. There would never again be as favorable to the Arabs an international resolution backed by the two superpowers. So it's an important footnote to history, but a very important one. Resolution 242, I'll review Bekitza 242's provisions just so we're on the same page, because it sets a context for the rest of the story. Israel's withdrawal, and here's the crucial language, from territories occupied in the recent conflict. And the big discussion at the time, it didn't say all the territories or the territories, it just said from territories. That was a major victory for the Israelis. End of the state of belligerency, the right of every state to be acknowledged as sovereign and, quote, to live in peace within secure and recognized borders, freedom of navigation in international waterways, which was a big Israeli concern, and the Arab concern, of course, a, quote, just resolution to the refugee problem. Finally, LBJ wisely held back from imposing a settlement after the Six-Day War. No withdrawal without peace agreement was his policy, but the Johnson administration did not have a clue about a prescription for normalization. No new ideas about Arab-Israeli peace, but not entirely. I want to refer to another document. A couple of minutes ago, I talked about the Walworth-Barber memo, which developed an approach toward Israel. McGeorge Bundy, who was he was the crucial guy in the foreign policy establishment under LBJ. He was at different times national security advisor and this and that, whatever. He wrote a memo to Lyndon Johnson, the famous Bundy Memorandum, okay, who's buried in Grant's tomb, right, in which he laid out the constraints on U.S. policy in the Middle East. The Bundy Memorandum says as follows: the United States is committed to Israel's survival, wrote Bundy, but also to good relations with pro-Western Arab states that want Washington to tilt against Israel. Pro-Western Arab states are Jordan and Saudi Arabia. Keeping Israel strong saves the United States the headache of defending it directly. But in the long run, said Bundy, getting Arabs and Israelis to make peace was the only way to resolve the inherent contradiction in American policy. That's a quote. So American administrations have oscillated between these conflicting concerns ever since. Let me move from LBJ to Nixon. And again, it was not so much Nixon, although Nixon was very canny when it came to foreign affairs, but it was Nixon and Kissinger. And it was all about three things: détente with the Soviet Union, linkage, all matters in conflict with the Soviet Union are linked. Russia would not be accommodated in one area, let's say the SALT agreements, the nuclear agreements, without a settlement in another area, let's say Vietnam. And of course, power politics, realpolitik. On this last, and Kissinger made it clear, and we unreconstructed liberals have always been very unhappy with Kissinger, little importance was given to human rights, legal niceties, moral standards, and the Israelis were divided on this. Some were troubled, many were troubled, traditional concepts of morality, so on, some saw it as opportunity. Now there was a lot going on in Nixon and during the Nixon administration, but one principle was transcended during Nixon 1, the first Nixon administration, and that was what became known as the Nixon Doctrine. No more entanglements. Instead, we're going to use proxy states to further American purposes. We don't want to send American troops anywhere. There was already an entanglement in Vietnam. So for this, we need an Israel unencumbered by conflict. And the thinking was in the Middle East that Iran would replace the British, Israel would replace the USA, which would contain the Soviet Union. Replacing the British, by the way, just in terms of the history, the government of Harold Wilson, the Labour government Harold Wilson, 1968, pledged that Great Britain would leave the Gulf by 1971, so Iran would be the new Britain, and Israel would be the new USA. Now, the famous Rogers plan, 3 plans, they were garnished, they were complicated matter, but I forget the details, except to say that the gravamen of the Rogers plan, nobody understood them then, nobody remembers them then for good reason, to bring Egypt in the picture as a negotiating partner, have Israel withdraw first, and then give the Arabs some sort of guarantee, and then the Arabs would give some sort of guarantee of permanent peace. It was, to use Lashon Nakia, it was a lot of baloney, you know what I'm saying here, and it was certainly not the formal peace treaty that was demanded by Israel. But more to the point, forget whether it was baloney or not, Henry Kissinger, who was all about realpolitik, did not like this. Reward a Soviet client? Forget it, not a chance. Then, of course, the October War, moving very rapidly here, 1973, what we call the Yom Kippur War, completed the transition of the Arab-Israeli dispute from a nuisance to a conflict central to American diplomatic and strategic concerns. That was probably the main outcome of the October War in terms of the larger geopolitical issue. 3 points to remember about the Yom Kippur War. First, everybody remembers Yom Kippur, right? The war led to a direct US-Soviet confrontation. It provoked a crisis in the Western Alliance, as had 1948 and 56, but even more so. And the crisis, of course, was literally fueled by OPEC, quadrupled oil prices. So that became the compelling problem of the 1970s. The Arab-Israeli dispute, fueled by oil, for the first time became a factor in US economic recessions and in US relations with the Third World. And the implications of this resonate yet today. Not going to go into Watergate except to say that domestic politics always influence foreign policy. Nixon needed a major foreign policy success, solve the oil embargo, and he would pressure, he felt that if he would pressure, well, it was Kissinger, if I pressure Israel enough, I would have that victory. But at the same time, he felt that he could not afford to alienate America's Jews. This was not 1948 or 1952, and who cared? And the fear of devastation of America's economy offset the traditionally strong pro-Israel sentiment. Turned out, in hindsight, we understand that the oil crisis, it turned out, was a boon to American business. Petrodollars created this enormous market for American goods and British goods. But the bottom line was there was a growing attention paid to the Arab world, and the war provided opportunities for the first time for Arabs to express their views on the conflict with Israel and be listened to. It strengthened the Arab case within the policy-making community, which was traditionally pro-Arab in any case. For the first time, there was the suggestion that national interest demanded closer ties with the Arabs, even if it forced major Israeli concessions. This is a point I'll come back to. It was during this time that Henry Kissinger began to push the idea, and here's the term of art that Kissinger created, that Kissinger crafted, the idea of an intransigent Israel. We never heard that before until Kissinger said it. After all, Israel had not deterred the Arab assault, and this suited Henry Kissinger perfectly. He needed a weaker Israel lobby in order to negotiate more flexibly. By 1975, this idea of an intransigent Israel had become currency amongst policy figures, academics, even in some public opinion polls. So you want to know where this idea came from? It came from Kissinger in 1974. Begin was elected in 1970. I'll come to it right now. He was elected in 1977, the Begin Revolution. Kissinger prefigured that, again to use that Christian term, already 1974, he was talking about an intransigence, but your point is an important one. Thanks very much. We'll get to Begin in a couple of minutes. Kissinger, you know, Nixon, again, not a nice guy for many reasons, but on Israel he was just fine. But the legacy of Kissinger's Realpolitik are yet with us, which brings us to Jimmy Carter. And we need to stop with Jimmy Carter. We need to stop on Jimmy Carter for a couple of minutes because his presidency was a watershed in a very bad way. You know, remember the Carter book on Israel? You know, it's called Apartheid. You know, Peace or Apartheid. Right, Peace or Apartheid. We all remember the apartheid part. We don't remember the peace part. So it didn't come from nowhere. What it came from was, again, a particular worldview shared by Jimmy Carter and Zbigniew Brzezinski. Now, 4 points characterize the Brzezinski Weltanschauung. First, a de-emphasizing of the issue of relations with the Soviet Union. This did not mean that Brzezinski was not a hardliner when it came to Soviet Union. He certainly was. He was one of the hardest of the hard. But this area was no longer the organizing principle of American foreign policy. Second, a diminished preoccupation with worldwide communism as a threat. For example, Carter tried to normalize relations with Cuba, with Vietnam. An important byproduct of this policy was a willingness to deal with, for the first time, pro-Soviet, anti-American regimes. Carter and Brzezinski flirted with radical black African nations. You know, are we going somewhere here? You know, who was the main anti-communist force in the Middle East? Of course it was Israel, but who cared? The importance of the third world in international politics was a third point in hallmark of the Brzezinski foreign policy. Third world, India, Brazil, Nigeria, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia. These and others were third world countries with significant resources. And fourth, of course, as the previous presidents, a disinclination to use force to achieve diplomatic objectives. Negotiation, right? Let's talk them to death. There was a greater reliance on economic dynamics, on international interdependence. And, you know, this, of course, was reinforced by the second iteration, part two of the energy crisis in the late 1970s. Economics was more important than military power in international affairs, was the result of this. So, and of course, this emphasis on human rights, the human rights campaign, 180-degree turn from Kissinger. It's important to understand these details because they are crucial in understanding Brzezinski's Middle East policy. The Middle East, to Carter and Brzezinski, was a model for their global conceptions and go a long way to understanding why the Carter administration was so troubling for Israel. First, the Soviet Union was seen as an ally in achieving an Arab-Israeli settlement. In addition to whatever the problems the Israelis had with the Russians, plenty, well, one thing Israel never wanted, ever, was another person at the table, especially the USSR. So Carter, at best, when it came to this, was a meddler. Second, there was diminished concern over communism in general, the concomitant desire to win over Arab anti-American regimes. At the time, we don't remember this, but we were wooing Syria, Ba'athist Iraq, Algeria, Libya, and for the first time, the PLO. The human rights agenda was pressed against countries with whom the U.S. had influence, and those are the two countries, of course, was Iran and Israel, and in Israel's case, on the beginnings of the West Bank settlements. When the settler movement started is a whole discussion, but by the time of Carter, it was there. And finally, related to the PLO business, Palestine, quote-unquote Palestine, had come to symbolize third world aspirations. The Carter administration was identifying American policy with the objective of a Palestinian homeland. This was new, this was significant. Carter and Brzezinski never liked Resolution 242, which had been a centerpiece of American Middle East policy for more than 10 years. Oil replaced the Soviet Union and anti-communism as Washington's preeminent concern. OPEC, remember OPEC? OPEC was the guy. OPEC was officially viewed as an instrument of determined Arab nations rather than as an international cartel of thugs responsive to economic forces. So Arab-Israeli settlement was linked to the oil issue, and it became the means to stabilize the oil supply and even avert an even more serious energy crisis. And now, all of this led to kind of a contextual notion of what was going on. Each administration since Truman had tried some kind of initiative aimed at solving the Arab-Israeli conflict, what we would call today the peace process. But Carter and Brzezinski viewed the Middle East peace as the equivalent of world peace. English translation. You solve the Middle East, there's a possibility of solving peace problems throughout the world. And the idea, and again, the term of art, which we first heard then, and now, of course, as currency, the idea of a comprehensive settlement. We all know those words, as if Arabs and Jews were the only people in conflict in the Middle East. The Middle East is an area of inherent conflict. We know that, Sunnis and Shias, and this and that, and the Copts, and Iran and Iraq, whatever. But the Arabs and Jews are the only people in conflict in the Middle East. Arabs and Jews, of course, were just one of 50 conflicts in the region. So you solve the Arabs and Jews, you solve the Middle East, you solve world peace. Very simple, pashut. A word about Sadat and Camp David, and then we'll move on. 1977, November 1977, Sadat goes to Jerusalem and rendered obsolete any U.S. move for a summit conference on the Middle East. That was Carter's idea. He was not enthusiastic. After all, Carter, by seizing the initiative, sabotaged Carter's big, grandiose idea of a Geneva conference, which would have included the USSR and the Palestinians, did not consult with Washington, did not consult with the Arabs who counted, with Saudis. On the Israeli side, Menachem Begin, who had just become prime minister in 1977, committed a major tactical blunder. He was new to the job, and he felt that he needed a hechsher from Washington. After 30 years of insisting on direct negotiations, the prime minister calls Washington for approval. Unbelievable, bizarre, but it happened. In fact, Begin and Sadat could not arrive at an accord. The idea was that of an independent Palestinian state that was Sadat's centerpiece. And this failure brought Carter to center stage in the peace process. And of course, there was a huge triple arms sales package, Israel, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia as a reward for cutting themselves off from the Soviet Union in 1973. So Camp David, Carter was the key. The Israelis and Egypt and the Egyptians did not meet directly after the first 2 days, only via the Americans. We know that. Quickly, the provisions of Camp David, because I want to move on. Phased withdrawal from Sinai within 3 years. Normal diplomatic and commercial relations. They happened, weren't so normal, the Cold Peace, whatever. Limited force zones and UN forces to separate the Israeli and Egyptian armies, whatever it meant, but it worked. And +4 in the West Bank, the provision was a 5-year transition administration, and the administration would be Egypt, Jordan, and Israel with final status negotiations by the 3rd year. Of course, by 78, 79, all was forgotten. SALT II was finalized, the Shah was deposed, the Ayatollahs took over. It was a different world. I'm not going to talk about the Reagan years, but I want to rehearse the more recent history. This is getting already more recent. The first Bush, the forgotten George Bush, now known as all these initials, George H.W. Bush. Right, George H.W. Bush. This was not a great time for America-Israel relations. First of all, the legacy of Kissinger's intransigent Israel was in the atmosphere. There was a frequent sniping on the part of the administration officials, including by George Bush himself. And many of us will remember the dreadful moment when Bush, he was confronted, there was big demonstration in Washington. A lot of pro-Israel advocates came to Washington, pro-Israel demonstrations and activists, entirely legitimate, certainly legal. So Bush gets up there and kvetches. They are all out there, and I'm one lonely little guy here. There was clearly the odor of old-fashioned anti-Semitic scapegoating in the air, and worse. The comment undermined one of the principles, core principles of a democratic and pluralistic society, the ability, indeed the desirability to express political views, social views, and to advocate on behalf of those views. And Bush was undercutting that completely, and it was a hint, and I said, earlier, I have a very high threshold when it comes to anti-Semitism. There was this faint odor of anti-Semitism in the air about it. A lot of people written, I wrote about it, whatever. And of course, how can we forget, Secretary of State James Baker couldn't have put it better. I don't know if this is being televised, it's a family program, but he said, fuck the Jews. They don't vote for us anyway, direct quote. He was right, of course, but hey, So anyway, the second Bush had, I don't know, this idea that Bush was, completely pro-Israel and so on, whatever it was, but he had very limited interest in Israel. He didn't have much interest in anything. His issue was his issue was the oil-producing, the oil-producing nations. He was in bed with Saudis, with Saudi Arabia. But of course, he turned it around with one speech, September 11th. No, sorry. In the aftermath of September 11, on September 24th, he gave a speech, a very important speech on Israel, and from that point on, he became the fave of the Israelis, of the Israeli lobby, of American Jews and such. Now, I want to say a couple of words about Obama. We have a couple of minutes left. But, the last 2 decades, the stances of the administrations, of course, of all the administrations, including Obama, have been informed by the collapse of communism, communist regimes. It's immediately obvious to any fifth grader. The fact that there's no more Soviet Union, and one of the issues in the foreign affairs debate, and it comes up all the time, is, to put it bluntly, the question of Israel's utility as a bulwark against the bad guys. The bad guy, of course, was the Soviet Union, the Seksuch on communism. In the old days, it was an easy argument to make, not always embraced, but the argument was there. And so in an era when the peace process flawed, there is no peace process, there are settlements of allegations of legal abuses of Israeli Arabs, West Bank Arabs, intramural strife in Israel. It becomes tough for any administration if there is less of an internationalist justification. I'll come to you in a second, of support of Israel. And on top of all, of course, there's Iraq and so on. The speech, right, the Cairo speech, which in conventional mind of everyone, especially most of the Jews, the famous speech, the one in which he invoked the 1967 borders. And big tararam about it. He's attacked, you're anti-Israel, you're anti-Semite, you're anti-Jewish, you're anti-this, anti-that. In fact, my reading of it, and the reading of many others indeed, was that it was a positive speech. I would note a number of points. What did he say? He said in the speech, and listen, by the way, I'm not an unlimited fan of Obama. I think there have been many problems and this and that, whatever. Even we progressives have some serious questions about Barack Obama. But what he said in the speech is as follows. First, the U.S. is opposed to unilateral declaration of Palestinian statehood. That was an important issue at the time, still is, and he said it. Second, he said Israel is a Jewish state. It subsequently emerged that became an issue. He said it. A Palestinian state, whatever that might be, must be demilitarized. He said it. The U.S. relationship is permanent, shared history and values, unshakable commitment to Israel's security, positive rhetoric. Peace only through negotiations. Sixth point, the Hamas-Fatah agreement, which had just happened, is deeply problematic. We don't like it. Israel's security concerns must be met. The right to self-defense, phased withdrawal of Israel military from the West Bank, and even on the point that everybody made on this business of the 67 borders, even on the 67 border matter, there were three qualifiers. First of all, I said it's only the word he used was a basis, very important, a basis for discussions, mutual swaps, and secure and recognized boundaries. So even on that, it's the harsh rhetoric, the anti-Obama rhetoric was not justified, even on the 67 border business. Bibi Netanyahu, on hearing this speech, should have declared victory. Everything about the speech was great, but yet I guess he was looking over his right shoulder at the time, as he often did, or the American right, whatever. So he lambasted the speech, lambasted Obama. Thanks very much, everyone.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.